Over to you, Elizabeth.
All right. Thank you guys. Happy Tuesday. This is the Let's Talk Racism Experiences and Impact. And today I am so very excited. As you can see on the screen, we are bombarded by Davids, all Davids, and we'll explain that maybe sometime here. But imagine a world with no racism or any instance where your identity did not negatively impact your quality of life, how people treated you, how successful you become, where you are not judged by the color of your skin, but by the content of your character, as Martin Luther King said. The first few weeks, we have been having a conversation that sheds light on how racism looks like in everyday life. Today, we focus primarily now on what we can do to create this just world, this dream that Martin Luther King and other pioneers of justice have been talking and pushing, things that we are talking about and pushing for change at the local to the global level. It is a lofty dream, but one we have to dream and work towards. And today we have a modern day Goliath, David and Goliath kind of battle, right? And how fitting is it that I am joined by real life Davids that represents the various sectors in our society, from the faith-based organization, the judicial system, international affairs, education and health system. So plug in. We welcome you to share this, to comment, and to dialogue with us from wherever it is you're tuning in. And we ask you to dream with us on a blank canvas what needs to happen for us to have society where it is the character and how hard you work or your values that guide who you are. So welcome, welcome, welcome. And without further ado, I know you're wondering, what is up with the David thing? I feel like I need to call myself David, but I'll handle Elizabeth. So we have a very...
Hey, Davette.
Yes, right? Yeah, Yvette. Exactly. So we have 3 Davids today. And I want to introduce each and every one of them before I ask a question. Of course, David Washera, just go ahead and wave. He is not new to this panel. He was here 2 weeks ago, and he'll be helping me moderate this conversation. But let me introduce first Pastor David Pfizer. Pastor Dave, if you can just wave at us.
Hey.
David is an associate pastor at the Well Community Church in Silver Springs, Maryland. He holds a Master's of Divinity degree in Pastoral Studies through Talbot School of Theology and is currently a third-year doctoral student. David, all the best to you, bro, because that PhD world, woo! Anyway, it's another story. He is pursuing a Doctor of Ministry in Urban Ministry. He is married to his beautiful wife, Sarah, of 5 years. David and Sarah recently welcomed their firstborn son, Dominique, on June 1st. So a whole 29 days ago.
That's right.
And you are awake and smiling and just functioning. We appreciate you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yes, and they currently live in Washington, D.C. So David, so glad to have you.
Thank you.
Right beside him, we have David Henderson. David Henderson is a civil rights lawyer fighting to end systematic injustice at Wellinger Law. David earned his BA in Plan 2 honors and his law from right here in Texas, guys, UT. UT Austin, I assume, David?
Of course.
All right. See,
Is
there
there
we go.
another UT?
We knew we liked you for a reason, right? Afterwards, he joined the litigation section of one of Texas' largest law firms. Though David enjoyed the intellectual challenges of complex litigation, he wanted to try cases. So he joined the Special Crimes Division of the District Attorney's Office. Now, David, is this the Special Crimes Division we see on TV? You know,
Just like TV.
Nice.
I can't say all of it's just like TV, but the special crimes idea is just like TV.
Wow. So then I have a law degree from TV, actually. So if you ever need a partner to go ham, I'm right here with you.
Okay.
So through that, David tried over 70 jury cases to a verdict ranging from civil cases to human trafficking to capital murder. David was so successful in court that the Texas District and County Attorneys Association invited him to train other attorneys across the state, including the TDCAA semi-annual trial skill course. So this is a stellar guy, guys. He can do good on TV, but he fights in real life, and we are so thankful to have you. So
Glad to be
from
here.
his first presentation, David was the most highly rated speakers. And additionally, in the DA's office, he was named Criminal Justice Member of the Year and received the President's Award. And you are also a Toastmasters.
That's right.
You are a public speaker.
Wow.
So
don't hold anything I say tonight against Toastmasters.
And in 2010, he won its World Champion of Public Speaking after competing against 30,000 contestants from 113 countries. Though he competed to become a better lawyer, David delivered his best speech outside the courtroom when he convinced Dr. Josephine Dinwood to marry him. And yes, she said yes, guys. She liked it so much that she etched a copy of that on their mantelpiece. David Henderson, welcome and glad to have you as well.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, so guys, you can see we have an extensive group of people. I mean, from A to Z, and this is the beauty of these conversations. Everybody needs to be at the table. Everybody needs to put their hands to the plow, because it takes all of us, regardless of race, regardless of religious background, regardless of upbringing, what you do. It's all of us fighting for humanity, because we represent the human race. So to jump right off, let me ask an introduction question, and Pastor Dave, I'll start with you.
Okay.
So when were you first aware of your race or cultural heritage?
Oh, that's a loaded question.
Yes, it is.
I grew up in the burbs of North Dallas, and obviously by you can tell I'm white, and so I think for the longest time I didn't think I had a culture. I remember thinking to myself, man, I wish I had a culture. You go to a grocery store and there's all these different foods, and then there's that one aisle of the ethnic food, and it's like, oh, that's not me. I remember growing up in Plano, and I had one neighbor who was Indian, one neighbor who was Chinese, but they always, we loved them. We were cordial with them. They were great neighbors, but there was always that sense of other, right? That they're the ones that aren't, in a sense, normal. And people like me, my family, the church that I go to, that's what we're normal. And that kind of, I would say, mentality I carried with until, not even in high school, we had maybe 2 Black people at our high school. And so that mentality I carried with probably till college, when I was really exposed to diversity, where I had really good friends, Black, white, Hispanic, Vietnamese, straight, gay, you name it. When we were just really good friends. And that was when I started to kind of realize, like, oh, okay, like there's yeah, I do have a culture. There are certain values that I've been brought up with. And then when I went to seminary, I served in an underserved neighborhood in Bellflower, California, where we were primarily working with undocumented families, African-American families, the poor and the elderly. And it was really through those experiences that I kind of realized, like, oh yeah, like, being white is its own thing, right? So, I was the only one wearing rainbow sandals in my community, right? I was the only one listening to Mumford and Sons in my community. And so I was like, oh, there's certain things about the white culture. I'm the only one who doesn't really have rhythm, and I can't really keep the beat. And so I was like, oh, these are kind of things that are about my culture, in church, right? Like in preaching, we just, like, my people, we just kind of like to sit and like kind of nod, and we would have people, when I would preach, they'd just yell out amen, and I'd be startled, right?
Yeah.
And so it was kind of through those experiences that I started to realize, like, oh, okay, understanding my whiteness, understanding my cultural heritage. Mm-hmm. And then really the last 3 years is when my wife and we moved to Washington, D.C., and we moved into a neighborhood called Anacostia, which is an historically underserved African-American neighborhood. And I'm like the only white guy on my street. And that's when I really realized, just being a minority in my neighborhood, wow, like I am really different than the people around me. And so that's kind of been my story, somewhat in a nutshell.
Yes, awesome. So your interactions and experiences with others called attention to the diversity that you bring. And that's a really good point because you were able to, from what I hear, able to appreciate that difference because it was not treated as something negative, right? So that's very good. David Henderson, off to you. When were you first aware of your race or cultural heritage?
I don't remember a time when I was not aware of being Black. I thought about this question for a while, and even if you go back to childhood, I have no conscious memory of thinking of myself as being anything other than a Black person, so a Black boy, then eventually a Black man. When I was growing up, and I know that I didn't grow up in the worst time period in the United States, but it was not as politically correct as things are now. So even as a child, you would get called the N-word when you're growing up in Texas. People would refer to you as a Black boy growing up in Texas. It's a more difficult question for me. I can give you a more difficult question for me to answer. My wife asked me, and this was, I think, about 2 years ago when we moved to Dallas, and we noticed more racial tension in Dallas than what we experienced in San Antonio. And she asked me one day, do you think about the fact that you're Black? And I said, that's a strange question. She said, I've never had to think about the fact that I'm Black before I moved to Dallas. And I responded to her by saying, I don't think a day goes by that I don't think about being Black. I don't know if an hour in a day goes by when I'm not conscious of being Black. And often this is because of the fact that I deal in a career field where it's necessary for me to learn how to communicate well, and being conscious of who you are and what your surroundings are definitely impact your ability to communicate effectively. So yeah, with that question, I do not remember a time when I was not conscious specifically of being Black. I do believe when I got to college, I got to experience a better perspective on what my heritage is as a Black person in the United States. Another thing that I think has changed a lot in recent years is the way history is taught in schools has dramatically improved. And I didn't have an interest in history for the majority of my younger years because it felt very exclusionary the way that it was taught in the schools that I attended. When I went to college, I had professors who were diverse and they taught history in a completely different way. It did open my eyes to the full experience of what it means to be a Black American. But in terms of just being conscious of my race and cultural background, I can't remember a time when I was not.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. That's a very good point. And let me lead you to the next question here. If you can share a scenario where you experienced or saw racism firsthand for yourself and what you did about that.
So I'll start by saying this. We live in a time now where we're very conscious of people having the right to choose who they want to be and what they want to be. The problem with race is that race is a social construct that gets imposed on you. Based on the way that people look at you and what they see, they decide how you're going to be categorized and how you're going to be treated. So even though I experienced racism growing up by hearing people call me the N-word or refer to me with other derogatory terms or just point out the fact that my skin color is different than theirs, the first time I truly remember experiencing racism for what it means in an institutional sense, I had to go meet with my guidance counselor in high school. I think I was a freshman or sophomore, and I had to turn in my resume before I met with my guidance counselor. And I knew what my guidance counselor looked like because I'd seen him in the office before. I knew which counselor mine was. And when I had to have this meeting with him, I showed up early. I was seated in the waiting area, and then he came out and I stood up to shake his hand, and he walked past me and said, excuse me, I have to meet with David Henderson right now. And he went and he grabbed a white student who was walking out the door. And I hadn't processed what happened. I just remember when he grabbed the white student and he said, David, I need to talk to you. The assistant was sitting at her desk and she snapped at him. She said, that is David Henderson. And I couldn't process what was making her upset. I didn't realize until later. Oh, I guess based on my resume, he assumed I must not have been Black.
Yeah.
And then he turned back and he looked at me with this puzzled look. And again, I was still young enough to where I hadn't fully processed what just happened, but it took him a while to register that the person he read about on paper could be the young Black man that he saw standing up in front of him. Now, that experience has been replicated in other contexts. As an adult, it happens mainly when I talk to someone over the phone and they have not yet met me in person, and they meet me in person and I can tell the shock from what they experienced or said over the phone before we actually had the chance to meet.
Yes. Wow. That's That's something that in the last conversation I also shared as well, is the shock and having to say no, that is me as well. The paper is me. I am the paper, and
I'm breathing.
the paper and I are one and the same. Yes, exactly. So Pastor David, talk to us about, maybe share with us a scenario where you experienced or saw racism firsthand, and what you did about it.
That's a good question, and it's a complicated question because I don't really think I've experienced racism firsthand.
Mm-hmm.
Living in our neighborhood in Anacostia, I'm the only white person there, and so our neighbors are often suspicious of me because they think I'm a cop or I'm there to buy drugs. And I don't know if that's racism. I think sometimes that's just the product of living in a racialized society, potentially. Mm-hmm. But, I've never felt like just discriminated against based on the color of my skin. I think I've been on the opposite end of giving racism or dishing out racism, to be honest with you. I've been on a journey. I've not arrived. I'm not even close, but certain things on my Facebook memories will pop up and like, oh gosh, like I said that, or I believe this way. Certain interactions I've had with people in my church staff before, things that I have said, things that I didn't say, contributed towards racism. Even just kind of checking out who do I don't know, just the things that I value, the people who I think fit certain descriptions. I'm like, wow, there's racism that's just kind of embedded in me. And so it's been a process of really trying to root it out and being honest and reflective of myself. So that's personal. With friends, I've noticed this. I've seen it a lot with friends. My sister-in-law is a Mexican American, and the first time my grandfather met her, called her a racially derogatory term. And that has stuck with her to this day, about 15, 20 years later. My wife is a South Asian American, and we travel before the kid frequently. And many times she will get stopped by security and I will not, right? Mm-hmm. I've had good friends, people that I love, people I would die for. We're driving in the car and my friend says, racism doesn't exist. And then a man, maybe from the Middle East with a turban, cuts him off in the road. And he says a racially derogatory term, not seeing this gap, right? Mm-hmm. And then I would also say, systemically, living in DC, it's really interesting. Because, the big news in DC right now, besides the protests, is Black Lives Matter Plaza, right? And they have that right by the White House. And it's really, and you're like, this is awesome, right? Finally, like our nation's capital is affirming Black lives. And I think in some ways it's a really good thing. But in a lot of ways, it feels very performative to me because I live in the neighborhood which we call east of the river, where like maybe it's 90, 95% Black. And the disparities there, you would feel like Black lives don't matter. My neighbor who I lived with for 2 years would say, David, do you see any playgrounds in our neighborhood? I was like, no, I don't see any playgrounds. And it made me realize, like, I started looking for playgrounds. The only playgrounds I saw were at the elementary schools. There were no communal playgrounds. But if I crossed the river into Capitol Hill, a predominantly white neighborhood, there's playgrounds everywhere, right? Grocery stores, for instance, right? So H Street, there's this corridor, H Street corridor in Washington, D.C., very gentrified, hip. There's like 3 grocery stores just on this one stretch. In my ward, I live in Ward 8. About 80,000 people live in this ward. There is one grocery store, right? And it's a poor Black neighborhood. And so a lot of people don't have transportation. So in order to get to the grocery store, you have to take the bus, public transportation, right? It's about a half-day journey just to go to the grocery store. right? So in one sense, I live in the city, it's like contradictions. It says by the White House, Black Lives Matter, but then when you live where the Black community lives, you just feel all the time like, man, they don't really think Black lives really matter, because if they did, there would be these basic things in place for the community to enjoy and participate in. And so those are some of the experiences that I have seen personally in my life.
Yeah. So as I turn this over to David, we've talked about experiences and impact, and now we want to turn and focus on solutions, right? And I like what you say, Pastor David, about we have it in policy that Black Lives Matter, but in the everyday where the lives are being lost, where the education system is failing our community, there's a complete disconnect, right? So the focus is now, what can we do? Viewers, as you are watching from wherever, we want you to really plug in and think about how, if you were the person that got cut off by that Middle Eastern individual, what would you do? Not say, you may say racism does not exist, but it comes down to action. What are we doing with our hands and our feet and our mouth, not just in writing? So David Washira, on to you to lead us to now the solutions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thank you to Pastor Fraser and David Henderson for the conversations that they just had. I think I was on this conversation 2 weeks ago when Elizabeth asked me that same question about sharing a scenario where I first experienced racism and what I did about it. And like David Henderson mentioned, I've thought about it for a while. And in fact, there were unfortunately so many to pick and choose from that I couldn't really remember which was the first one. And over the past 2 weeks, I've been like combing through my mind, trying to figure out, going back through this unfortunate record, trying to remember. I do know that they really did begin when I moved to the United States. And the first vivid memory that I recalled that I did share with last time was there were 3 boys, two whites and myself. And actually the other gentleman was from Peru. So it was Hispanic and a young white boy and myself. And we were playing, this was in Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. And we were just, 3 kids having fun, and we decided to play the Who's Who game. And, as kids do, we said, okay, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, I would like to be president someday. And so I'll play the commander in chief, I'll be the president. And the young boy, who I won't mention his name, looked at me. He goes, "No, you can't do that." And I said, why can't I do it? I thought it was just because he wanted to do it. And he goes, "Because you're Black. You can't be president because you're Black." And I thought, I didn't know much about history at the time because I was in 7th grade. And I said, I don't think it's prohibited. But he was emphatic that I could not be president, and we let it pass. And we're like, okay, fine, I won't be president. I'll be something else, right? And looking back at these days, I think to myself, okay, this was a young kid, also in the 6th grade at the time, but it was so ingrained in him that I couldn't be president because I was a Black kid, at least based on the history that he had seen. And I thought to myself over the past 2 weeks, what happens when that young kid grows up? If he doesn't come across this fork in the road and take maybe a route that, Pastor David Fraser had taken, right? And he went on that particular one. And then I thought to myself, of a country of 350 million people, how many more are like him when the population is overwhelmingly Anglo in this country? So that's what I've been masticating over the last 2 weeks. But to jump right into the question at hand, over the past 2 weeks, we have focused on the impact of racism on individuals and society. And today we would like to discuss solutions on tackling the occurrences of racism at the local level where we as individuals live, but also while focusing on what it looks like at the institutional level. Mm-hmm. My friend David Henderson published a really amazing article on Newsweek. Go check it out. And it was titled Qualified Immunity in Helping Police Get Away with Murder. And so are prosecutors. And this was written at the time when you were working in the DA office, David. Using that particular title and the article, let me jump into the first question and over to you. And the first question is, what can be done or put in place to improve the experiences surrounding race in the institutions or organizations that we represent or work with?
Absolutely. I have to go back to something you said a minute ago, David, and that is when you talked about moving here from the US, I think an important thing to remember when we talk about racism and the way it works in this country, you had an advantage, and my wife Josephine had the same advantage in that you spent at least some of your formative years in a place where the people who were doctors and lawyers and accountants had the same skin color that you do. I know your father. I have a lot of respect for your father. Your father has a PhD. Where I grew up, my father had a high school education. My mother had a high school education. And my dad has read Hamlet 3 or 4 times, or he did before he passed. So he's a very bright man. But in terms of having access to people who had education or who had done something even comparable to the types of things we dreamt of doing growing up, we didn't have access to any of those things. So when we start to consider racism on an institutional level, I don't want people to think it's as simple as people calling you a name. I think any Black person who's lived in the United States for a period of years has gotten over what it means to be called a name or treated rudely when you walk into a store. What defines our experience is being limited in terms of the progress you can make in your career based on who you are. Now, since you mentioned the article on qualified immunity, I think that's a very good example. In order to have structural change when it comes to racism, we're first going to have to be willing to admit as a country that race plays a factor in some of the topics that we're discussing. I think it's taken over a decade for us to finally come to terms with the fact that there's a problem with excessive force used by police departments because it directly relates to race in terms of how they often treat people. And I literally think it's taken that being caught on camera a number of times for America to finally wake up to the fact that this is real. And that's only step number 1 in terms of actually dealing with some of these systemic problems. And gosh, Pastor David was pointing this out when he was talking about, we say on the one hand in Black Lives Matter Plaza that Black Lives Matter, but if you walk a few blocks over, you don't actually see it. And that's because we're talking about Black Lives Matter solely in the context of excessive force used by police departments. We haven't even gotten to the broader debate. I don't know if I'm straying a bit from your question or if I'm on target with where you're hoping the conversation to go.
No, I think you're hitting the nail on the head on this one, because I was listening just last week to uncomfortable conversations with a Black man, and the gentleman gave an example of where we are. Well, in terms of a lot of well-meaning and like-minded Americans that we have met across this great nation who say no, we have equal opportunity. You can get a house. You can look at you, David. You're a perfect example of progress. But it hides the fact that systematically over the period that this country has been in existence, and even before that, Black people as a population and other colored people have been marginalized, one either by slavery, and even the institutionalized form of keeping them out of public voting, the Jim Crow laws. And so just because we lifted this blanket with the 1960s and passed the Civil Rights Acts, and you have the Brown Board of Education where you desegregate schools, and then we're like, okay, now everyone is on the same playing field, equal opportunity for everyone, so there should be equal outcomes. But you find that as a race and as a people, colored people have been, they've been so far behind in terms of getting caught up. Like they gave the example of a race where it started, the gun went off and somebody took off, and now the 200-meter mark, that's where we're telling David Henderson and the likes, and be like, okay, now you can go and win this 400-meter race, but the guy's already ran half the race. It's going to take a great deal of effort to get you there. So in regard and what I was pointing to on this aspect of institutions is, at the societal level, we have this, and the individuals, what you see in Anacostia, Pastor Dave, at the individual aspect. How do we go to about moving that, on everyday, the everyday David Henderson, in with meeting in his counselor's office, to where that now moves that to the institutional part, where we start solving these things. Is it as simple as passing the laws? Maybe that's what I should be getting to. Or is it as simple as, okay, no, you're not calling people names. We will bring more books to your schools. And what is it beyond that?
Pastor David, I want to cut you off because I've been talking a lot. You're leaning forward like you've got something to say. Did you want to jump in?
To be honest, I wasn't sure if it was my turn to answer or which David.
Go ahead, Pastor David.
David's.
Go ahead. I'll go after you.
No. David Henderson, you go.
You know, I think that when we start talking about specifics, we're putting the cart before the horse when it comes to dialoguing about race in this country. We have a rule when we're studying the law, and I think it's a good rule for the situation. That is, if you read a law and the law doesn't seem to make any sense, and sometimes the laws don't make much sense, if it seems that way to you, what you're supposed to assume is that there's not a problem with the law. There's a problem with you and the way you're reading the law. And when it comes to discussing race, I think that's the attitude we have to adopt before we can start talking about specific changes. I think that part of what happens with policing in America, which is something I spend a lot of time thinking about, so I'll often go to it as an example. I think that African Americans, I'm not even going to say African Americans, because I don't think that race even cares whether you're African American or African or you're a black or you're a dark-skinned person from Cuba. If you have black skin, or the closer you are to having black skin versus white, you get treated a particular way. And I think people who've been treated that way have been saying, this is unfair, look at what we're going through. And other Americans have a really difficult time wrapping their mind around it. So they assume, oh, this person must be exaggerating. I know what my impression of them is. I would never treat them wrongly based on their appearance. We look at videos and we think, oh, that person was arrested by the police. Something must have been going on. I was talking to a friend of mine this morning who was harassed by the police outside of his house. He is a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy. He served in the Air Force as an officer, and then he went to medical school at Harvard. And he'd had all these experiences before he was harassed outside of his house. And his words are, when I take that blue uniform off, when I take that white coat off, all people see is black skin, and they treat me accordingly before I even get the chance to open my mouth. You have to be willing to listen to his experience with the assumption that it is a valid experience based on something that actually happened that needs to be considered. That has to happen before you can move towards any type of specific changes. I think America's getting there, but again, it took how many videos of wrongful police conduct for people to finally accept, okay, this is actually a real thing. And it's not as though the entire country feels that way. We're still largely in denial, but that has to be the first choice. The first choice has to be to listen to each other with open ears and a soft heart so that we can process what other people are experiencing. Once we do that, then we can start working on meaningful changes. And I do want to make it clear, I think it's possible for us to make that adjustment. We just have to decide to do it.
Oh, that's very good. And actually, let me build up on that. So for the question to Pastor Dave, Pastor Dave, last 2 weeks ago, we had a gentleman very much like yourself. He was of Italian descent, Italian father, Mexican mother. So, but he looked, for all intents and purposes, white. And he gave that example of closed doors conversations and the racial discrimination that he had when he was around white circles and other people assumed that he was white. What a very good example he gave was when his landlord came and knocked on the door and said, oh, I just want to let you know that there will be some Mexicans that will be coming to mow the lawn. Just, don't get threatened by them. And the fact that, his mom was Mexican really took a great offense to that, because if I see people moving around this neighborhood and they happen to be Mexican, I should automatically, cringe, right? So going back to the example that you gave, Pastor Dave, of the car, where the person was said that, I'm not racist, and then got cut off by a Middle Eastern person and yelled out a slur. You're white, at least let's call it what it is. And based on growing up, you've been in quite a number of circles where you've probably been surrounded by other white people. This open mic, if you want to use the term, this, closed conversations when other people don't know that there are people of color or things going on. What are the type of the things that you have heard in targeting what David was talking about in terms of for us to acknowledge these things that are said when we don't think anybody else is listening, but then when we walk out the door, we walk out and say, oh no, I'm not racist. Everything is equal and you have equal opportunity. Can you give us a few examples and even maybe tell me how you address them as an individual?
Yeah, that's a great question. It happens all the time. So another good friend, person I love, person I would die for, knows my wife is Indian. And she told me, I don't want to move to that Plano neighborhood. This is Plano, Texas, okay? Safest place you could possibly imagine. Plano, Texas. I don't want to move into this specific neighborhood in Plano, Texas, because there are Indians that live in that neighborhood and they don't take care of their yards. Flat out. And she knew that my wife is Indian, right? And so, you know, I'm sure you all can experience it. It's these death by 1,000 cuts. And what those incidents, you might say, well, that's just ignorance, but what underlies that, right? What underlies that is that there are certain people in our country that do not matter, right? That are inferior, that are not as good as us. And when we talk about what can we do as a systemic level, what I've noticed is my white brothers and sisters, man, we saw the George Floyd video and now we want to act. Now we want to be woke. Now we want to march. We want to protest. We want to advocate for certain policies. But it concerns me because we have yet to actually develop what one of my professors, actually a Native American pastor, his name's Mark Charles. And he says, before we actually get racial reconciliation or conciliation or unity in this country, we need to develop a common memory. And he says, you cannot build community if you do not have a common memory, right? So if there are groups of people who are disagreeing on what your story is or don't know your stories, how can you really come together, right? So on one hand, in kind of majority, the dominant culture, the white culture, we have this myth, that's what Mark Charles says, and I believe him, that America's is exceptional, right? We are God's country. We're a Christian country. We're a city on a hill. We're the ones who, the Constitution, we create religious liberty for all, right? All people are created equal. We're the ones who liberated slaves, right? If you go to, there's a park in Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., where Abraham Lincoln is standing tall and kind of like, and there is a slave, and he's kind of, the symbol is basically him. He's the one freeing the slaves, right? And so we have this kind of narrative that we're exceptional.
Slave is on his knees.
Huh?
Slave is on his knees.
Yeah, the slave is on his knees. Look it up. What else? I mean, World War II, right? We're the ones who saved the world, right? We're the ones who saved the world. 9/11, all right? We're Americans, right? I remember listening to Toby Keith. I don't know if y'all know Toby Keith, but he had this song, and he says, it was in response to 9/11, and like, okay, we're gonna fight back. And this one line, he says, "We'll stick a boot in your ass. It's the American way," right? It's this narrative that we are exceptional people. But at the same time, there are all these other groups in America that would call BS to that narrative, right? There's Native Americans who have experienced genocide by the hands of my ancestors. Our favorite president, Abraham Lincoln, right, was the one who dictated genocide to Native Americans. During World War II, we put the Japanese in internment camps, right? We put them in internment camps. And then we think, well, we would never put people in cages again. And then voila, just 2 years ago, we're in outrage because now immigrants, children are separated from their parents and they're in cages. Then we talk about slavery, right? We think we're exceptional, but we have deemed Black people as 3/5 a person, as property. And so these narratives, right, have been going on throughout the beginning of our history. And we refuse to acknowledge it. And so my first thing would say, we need to develop a common memory. We can't just look at our own cultural narrative. We need to see other cultural narratives. And then the second thing I would recommend is that we need to kind of embrace the discipline of lament. And my doctoral professor, his name's Soong-Chun Rah, he has a book called Prophetic Lament. And he talks about how lament is prayer, where we intentionally look at the dead body in the room and we cry out, right? And so what that means is if you're in a funeral and you refuse to look at the dead body. And you were just saying, oh, like everything's great, everything's groovy, all this is awesome. You would say, this person is insane. This person is not right. But the biblical practice of lament is actually, it's encouraging us to actually grieve and to look at the dead body. And communally, and at least I can just speak for the church, we have to look at the dead bodies, the George Floyds, the Ahmaud Arbery's, the Breonna Taylors. We have to look at the dead bodies, the carnage that our country has participated in, and we need to grieve. And the reason it's important to grieve is because Jesus says this very clearly on the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "Blessed are you who mourn, for you will be comforted." And so comfort cannot happen, right? Peace cannot happen unless we cry and unless we grieve. And so I think the first step, at least if you're in white spaces, white-led organizations, especially the church, is, man, we need to develop this common memory, and we need to grieve, and we need to repent. And we can't just be the first ones to say, all right, I'm fine for racial justice. We need to repent and say, you know what? I didn't care when Trayvon Martin died, right? I didn't care when Michael Brown died. I don't care about Breonna Taylor. That was political. And we need to say that publicly and cry out and ask God to forgive our hearts. And I think that's the first step in this process. Sorry, I'm a pastor, so I preach, so I get on these tangents.
I think that really brings into context what David was saying about the acknowledgement part, and what you said about creating a common memory, is that we have to acknowledge that these things are happening. We have to ask ourselves, what is my role in this system? Have I been a bystander, and how can I change that? Let me go on to the next question, and over to you, David. Kind of switching gears here on what you had built on. David Henderson, I should be more specific on what we have said about actionable steps. We say for change to happen, individual action and change must also take place along institutional change. And in terms of that acknowledging part, what is the one thing we can all do individually today, taking steps towards eliminating racism? David, you have done, David Henderson, a pretty good job at calling these things out. I read your article, I saw your interview on MSNBC and on CNN on some of these steps, and I know a lot of them are focused on the police and the justice sector. But what as individuals in targeting those institutions can we do to take this action?
I think one of the biggest things you can do as an individual right now, and you said in terms of targeting these institutions, that makes me think that you're focused on the Black Lives Matter movement. Am I understanding you correctly, David?
Yes.
So I want to build on what Pastor David was talking about in terms of the way we perceive ourselves as Americans. I think you hit the nail on the head. Mm-hmm. We perceive ourselves as being ideal in terms of how we treat other people. And it's very difficult for us to acknowledge maybe we haven't done a perfect job of that. I think that's what's necessary to move towards change right now with the police department. And the reason that I can say that is because this isn't a discussion about Black Lives Matter. I want to make sure the listeners know that. This is not a discussion, let me say, solely about Black Lives Matter. But because it's such a big movement going on right now, if we're going to have a discussion about race, it behooves us to consider what we can learn from this movement and what we can do in the context of it. Mm-hmm. Part of the reason that I know people are not following some of the advice that we're offering in this discussion is because the responses people are giving to the Black Lives Matter movement are completely different from the same types of responses these individuals who are making them give in other contexts. That's unnecessarily confusing. So let me give you an example. People get very offended when you talk about eliminating qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is a legal doctrine that protects the police from liability when they violate people's constitutional rights. And to put this in context, it is not anywhere in the Constitution. It is not anywhere in any federal law. It is an idea that the Supreme Court invented. And the reason that I know that we're inconsistent with how we're arguing right now is because I hear conservative people arguing to keep qualified immunity. conservative people typically say judges should not make up the law. Lawmakers should make up the law. They're very adamant on this point. If that's true, then why are they willing to accept a conservative idea that was invented by judges? And that's exactly what qualified immunity is. One of the most conservative judges on the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, has said so. He said, we need to revisit this idea because it's something that the Supreme Court made up. And then the next thing you have to ask yourself is, if it's so inconsistent philosophically for a conservative person to be arguing to maintain a judicial construct, then why are they really advocating for that? And I think if you think about it critically, you're going to have to acknowledge that there's a strong history of racism with regard to why police forces were created in the United States and why we believe they need to be maintained. If you think about it critically, it's really hard to avoid that point. And if you're not willing to think about it critically, you just want to look at it from a historic perspective, there's a wonderful book called Killers of the Flower Moon. I think it's called Killer, singular, of the Flower Moon. It's a book about a Native American tribe that was created on a piece of land, not created on a piece of land, but inhabited a piece of land that had significant oil reserves. They were treated unjustly once they started making a lot of money off of those reserves. But it also talks a lot about the creation of modern police departments. And if you think about it, conservative people who believe very strongly in the Second Amendment, if you think about the reasons why they believe strongly in the Second Amendment, for those same reasons, they're going to resist the creation of police departments. And early Americans did. They didn't like police departments because they perceived police departments as being organizations that could assert control over society in ways that they shouldn't be allowed to. Police departments didn't begin to propagate and become institutionalized until they're perceived as being necessary to deal with people of color. So if you trace that history through, you can start to see why we would need police reform the way that we're discussing it right now. But you have to be willing to open your minds to those possibilities in order to get to that point. And I don't think you have to have a degree. I don't think you have to have gone to college and know a lot about history. I think you just have to be willing to treat your neighbor the way you'd want to be treated and open your ears and your heart so that you can listen and process some of this information. That's a mouthful, but does it make sense, David?
Yeah, it certainly does. And actually really led segue to my next question, which is to Elizabeth. So, on the first part, we talked about what can we do individually. On the next question, I want to focus at the institutional level and what can we do to inform and guide this change. So to Dr. E, to set this question in motion, David Henderson talked about the police and why the police was set up. And of course, along this whole movement, you're hearing a lot of things like defund the police. Which has been taken out of context in terms of what it specifically means. But just to give you an example in terms of quotas, the Los Angeles city spends $1.7 billion on its police budget and only $55 million on its health budget. This is in the middle of a pandemic that this is happening. Elizabeth, at the institutional level, given this aspect of where funding is being spent, what can we do to inform and guide this change? Are there ways that at the institution we can reform where our focus is and the narrative in order to bring about this problem in terms of solutions?
So that's a great question. And I think it goes along with what the other two Davids have been saying, right? About we have to, one, have that common memory, but also be willing to call the problem what it is. And it's a matter of priorities. Who is important? What is valuable? Where your money is, the Bible says, there your heart is as well. So until the value of a human life becomes valuable to everybody, regardless of what that human life looks like from a descriptive point of view, we will never change these ideas, right? Or we won't change these facts. And so, like with that budget, the American healthcare system, from a public health perspective, it's a very Band-Aid kind of treat. We throw Band-Aids on everything. We don't treat the root causes of things. We don't tackle those social determinants of health. But all of those underlying, as David Henderson says, is everybody, we are all created equal in the image of God, right? And until we acknowledge that, that in and of itself, and say the human life, regardless of who is on that hospital bed, is important. When you look at these injustices in regards to what they show up. The problem is so deeply rooted in society that what we are seeing right now, police brutality, what a Black mother dying, after giving birth in a hospital, 2 to 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related outcomes than a white mother. These are the symptoms of a deep-rooted sickness. And the underlying cause, I go back again to what is the value of human life? Who is worth fighting for? Who is worth funding? Who is worth catering and nurturing to? So the challenge, and David said it well, it's a simple one. Treat the other person as you would want to be treated. So until we acknowledge that there are individuals in our society that are not valued in comparison to other people, we will never be able to say, oh, that we have a problem, that I have a higher rate of dying from giving birth compared to my white friend, all because I am Black. My education is the same. My income is the same. The only difference is that I am a Black woman and not a white woman. So, and when you look at the literature in healthcare, everywhere, implicit bias, right? It's implicit bias. And the way we tackle that is to first acknowledge that implicit bias is coming out in our prescriptions. That if two people walk into the ER today, David Pfizer and David Henderson, with the same symptoms, they are the same age, the same height, and they have the same symptoms. David Henderson, his outcomes are more likely to be negative compared to David Pfizer. David Pfizer will have better outcomes in whether it's chest pain or whatever compared to David Henderson. And when you factor everything else, it's who and what is more valuable in that ER. So it comes back to, what do we value in society? Who do we value in society? And David Henderson mentioned, it's not Black lives, it's not just Black lives that matter, it's all lives that matter. But in this instance, the lives, the dead bodies in the room, the dead bodies on the streets, the people being shot in their own homes happen to be Black. And it does not matter whether they're Cuban, they're Puerto Rican, they're Kenyan, they're from Honduras. The Black skin is undervalued historically in every institution that you look at, and that has to change. At the underlying level, that has to change.
Wow, that's deeply powerful, deeply moving. It reminds me of a time when my mom had severely injured her leg, and I took her to the hospital. At that time, I didn't particularly understand what was going on, and the white doctor treated my mom, gave her some pain medicine, and then we came back home and looked at the prescription, and she had given my mom ibuprofen. Which is, you take that for slight headache, not when you have severe leg and nerve pain and you can barely walk. I had to call the doctor and explain to him, this pain medicine is not working. And it took a great deal of effort. And in the end, the doctor did not prescribe the medicine. We had to go see another provider because he did not believe my mom was in pain. He said, this is abusive. This is how people get into aspects of drug abuse. And I'm trying to tell him, she can barely walk. I can see that she cannot walk, but he would not prescribe the medicine. And this is some of these outcomes that Elizabeth is talking about. But switching that into a positive note for David, the other David, David Henderson, we can start with you and then go to David Pfizer. In your opinion, how fast do you see change coming, given this whole aspect of solutions that we have discussed, the deep root of the problem, the cancer in society? It reminds me of the quote by Martin Luther King, where he's so optimistic and so very hopeful, and he says, I've stood on the mountaintop and I've seen the promised land over in the distance, is there hope? Do we see it is it next year? Is it in my lifetime? How fast do you think this change can come about?
There's a difference between how fast I think the change is likely to come and how fast I think the change can come. I think the change can happen right now. I think if we are willing to make the change, it can literally happen right now. The lawyer in me knows that change tends to come very slowly because you have a significant part of the population that's typically not willing to change or not willing to change unless the change is forced. And that's when you get into situations where you have arguments that begin with the lawmakers and they carry all the way down through society. I'm tempted to offer two examples. Example number one, I went to the University of Texas for law school. I was one of 8 Black students in a class of about 400 students. What I found interesting was one of the professors researched the first year that an African American was allowed to go to the law school. We all know what year that was. It was 1969, a man named Heman Sweat. But he got curious. We all know Heman Sweat because he was the first person admitted to the law school. But did he have classmates who were Black? He went and he researched and found out that Heman Sweat either had 6 or 7 classmates who were Black back in the year 1969, the first year African Americans went to the law school. I went to law school in 2001. The year before me, you would think that if the first year Black people went, you had 7 or 8 students, you'd never have less than that again. In the year 2000, there were only 4 African American students that started. Actually, forgive me, I graduated in 2001. So this would have actually been 1997. There were only 4 students. In 98, when I started law school, there were 8 of us. And so the numbers didn't change much in a significant period of time. They're not much different now. Here in Dallas, Texas, I think SMU's starting freshman class, either last year or the year before, only had 1 African-American law student in it. So in terms of higher education, you're not seeing a lot of numbers change. In terms of people occupying higher positions in society, you're not seeing much change there. However, what I am deeply moved by are the number of white protesters I see marching in the streets for Black Lives Matter, especially younger people. They do seem to have a different perspective. And however we want to complain about how long it may have taken for this change to come about, it's here. You're actually hearing people talk meaningfully about changing doctrines like qualified immunity. 2 months ago, I told my wife, maybe I was an idiot wanting to be a civil rights lawyer and thinking I could have never made any change whatsoever, because it just seems impossible. But with the protesters out in the streets, they are doing work that it has taken civil rights lawyers decades to try to achieve. And again, because of the diversity that you're seeing in the protesters, as violent as the response to the protesters has often been, it'd be 10 times worse if you didn't have so many white people out protesting. And I don't think we'd have the ears that we do paying attention to what people have to say if you didn't have all these people who are out protesting. In addition, Josephine and I are getting a bit exhausted by all of our white friends who are calling us just to say, we never knew, we're sorry we didn't think about this more, we want to talk to you. It's kind of like a double-edged sword. Like, I don't know how many more conversations I'm going to have making my white friends feel comfortable about institutional racism. At the same time, I'm glad they're picking up the phone. All those things lead me to believe that there's more than ample reason for hope. At the same time, hope doesn't mean that you don't keep marching, you don't keep fighting, because we've got a long way to go. But I think the glass is half full, not half empty.
Yeah. Oh, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. And I'm glad that I would also say the same thing. I think we echoed it last week as well in terms of our white brothers and sisters, championing the cause by calling us and saying, "Hey, I didn't know this was happening," and it's in this particular, not to sound cliche, better late than never. And I'm really glad. I know I had one of my friend, who was white, hadn't renewed their license for about a year, and I could not imagine, and she goes, why would you do such a thing? I said, and she goes, but I've no one has ever asked me for it. I said, yeah, I can't go out my door without having my license.
There's a reason why we have on ties and Pastor David doesn't, right? Not a coincidence.
That's in my world, yeah. It's like, but anyway, over to you, Pastor Dave. The same question, how fast can this change come about? Are you hopeful? Are you less hopeful?
Oh man, that's a great question. Yes and no. I think yes, for the fact that, as all you have mentioned, there seems to be an awakening. I think COVID has obviously been a horrible thing for many people globally, but it made us slow down, and it made us watch and look at the dead body of George Floyd. And because of that, there's that communal outrage, right? It's like, I mean, right, you can't like, that's just racism. There's no way you can to explain it. And so what we've seen like in our church is, man, people who've never wanted to talk about it, people who say, hey, racism, we shouldn't talk about race in the church. Racism is more of a political issue. Let's like leave that out. Like, people want to talk about it. My good friend, Justin Adur, he's a pastor at Redeemer East Harlem. He just started an anti-racism class at his church. And he opened it up outside of his congregation. He told me 700 people attended the first class. He doesn't have 700 people in his congregation, right? So there is hope, and praise God for this. At the same time, since I'm a pastor, I feel like I need to talk about this a little bit. The difference between Black Lives Matter movement and the civil rights movement, the civil rights movement felt like it was grounded, had a Christian foundation. The Black Lives Matter movement, at least the organization, it doesn't feel like there's that same type of spiritual leadership. And so let me tell you why I think that is important, at least as a caveat, right? So how would I put this? It's important for us to answer the question, why is racism bad, right? And if it's just because it feels bad, I don't know if that's good enough. Because 20 years from now, we might have different feelings, right? And then 20 years later from that, we might have another different set of feelings. And so it can't be grounded in our feelings. And so then the question has to become, well, what must it be grounded in, right? Because if we live in a relative culture where what's true for me is not necessarily true for you, then 20 years from now, we can justify white supremacy again, or a different type of supremacy. And so something has to be grounded that is unchanging. And as a pastor, I would say, man, that unchanging reality is God. And what I found in our generation, is my generation specifically, is, man, we want to live we want to experience the benefits of the King, but we don't want to surrender to the King. But we have a King who is just. We have a King who is holy. We have a King who will not stand for injustice, right? So that's what gives me hope, but that's what I want my brothers and sisters in here who have kind of checked out in Christianity, and who are like, hey, I want the benefits of the kingdom, but I don't want to necessarily submit to the King. Is that version of Christianity is hogwash. What the Bible talks about, like Jesus talks about, like in Luke chapter 4, he talks about, man, he's a God of liberation. You know, Jesus says, I came to set the captives free. I came so that the blind will see. I came so that the lame will walk. I have come to set the captives free. Like, we have a King of liberation. And if it's grounded in that, then I have hope, because that's the King of liberation that is ultimately then going to end all of this nonsense, all of this wickedness, right? All of this sin. And he is going to establish the kingdom on earth where there's no more white supremacy, where there's no more injustice, where that beloved community that Martin Luther King Jr. so eloquently talks about becomes a reality. And so in a nutshell, I'm excited, but I want people to tap in, not just to the benefits of the kingdom, but to the King himself.
There's part that I got to add to, though, Pastor. I've got to add to this because I am a civil rights lawyer.
Okay, yeah.
Let me begin by saying I am Christian. I am actually auditing seminary classes right now. I'm in my first semester of Hebrew, which is oh so much fun. I'm sure you can identify with me.
Yeah.
And I ultimately agree with what you're saying. The only challenge you have to make sure to include in this conversation historically is that a lot of American racism has been built on a foundation of false Christianity.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I see that simply because people who are quick to speak Christ's name have also been quick to enslave people, brutalize them, and badly abuse them. Part of what we do have to keep in mind with the Black Lives Matter movement is it's pushing towards justice, and is basically asking if the laws we have on the books should be equally applied. I do want to agree with you, though. I think having a strong moral foundation is imperative to knowing the difference between right and wrong. I just think we have to keep in mind that when the Black Lives Matter protesters are protesting, if anyone has the foundations of Christianity as part of our cultural experience, it's just woven into the fabric of who we are, it's African America. Just had to add that caveat.
Oh, yeah, I think, yeah, you nailed it. I think white Christianity has been, I'm going to get some flack for this, but it's been bathed in white supremacy, right?
Unfortunately.
Like there's a reason we made Jesus white, and that's really sad. And it's typically, you know, scripture even says it, like, blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom. And, you know, historically in America, the poor, the oppressed have been the African American community, and they have been our prophets, right? They have been our prophets. They have been our leaders, our pastors, who have really, I think, spoken truth to power. And so I completely agree with you.
Thank you for that, both David. It's very good. And David Henderson, you brought up a point that I was going to strike on. Elizabeth, if you'll allow me just to take 2 minutes out of your time for Pastor Dave to answer this particular question on white evangelicals. Unfortunately, as David mentioned, Henderson, and I come from a small town in Texas. Let me preface it with that. That's where I grew up. A typical Central Texas town where I was one of very few Black people. And I went to went to school with many people who professed to be Christians. And for the lack of a better word, we'll use the term that was used then, or still used now, in terms of white evangelicals. And I've long felt, as an individual personal opinion, that white evangelicals have really dropped the ball in championing the cause of Christ vis-a-vis Black Lives Matter, vis-a-vis racial progress, and particularly when it comes to the voting booth, not to mention particular parties, because the things that are set up as being the moral fiber, as you mentioned, are quite the contrary to what biblical or Christian or even moral upright teachings are. So the racism that is being spewed by the politicians who are supported by quote unquote white evangelicals couldn't be far from the truth. So you find this, huge chasm. And as a Christian, I can say, of course, the message has been taken over. These are the wolves in sheep clothing. But I would really like to get from your perspective, coming from Texas and everything else. I mean, what's your feeling? Why have white evangelicals in America dropped the ball when it comes to fighting injustice?
Because I think we have worshipped the gods of individualism and consumerism and nationalism, to be quite frank with you. And those have been in bed with one another. I'll give you a story. So when I was in Texas, I went back to a white evangelical church that I grew up in. And it was when Trump was running for president. And, we all know what he said about immigrants, right? And what I found shocking was I just come from working with undocumented immigrants in my last church. These people have become my friends, family. And when I entered in this church, I was shocked by how much people loved Trump and they didn't have a problem with what he said. And just in the language of how we dehumanized undocumented immigrants, like calling them illegals and such like that. And so I was the youth pastor. I was like, I want to preach biblical justice here and just talk about what God says about immigrants, right? And I did it, right? I had this video of like 40 different verses on immigrants. I shared a video about, we call many, undocumented immigrants, we call them illegal, but we commit crimes, as lawyer David can probably attest to. We commit crimes every day, but we don't call ourselves illegal. And so I just kind of, at the end, I was like, hey, whether people are here legally or not, God calls us to welcome the stranger, at least on an individual level, right? We're called to welcome the stranger. Well, then afterwards, man, my supervisor came to me and he said, David, I don't want you, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, I kind of got reprimanded because he said, I don't want you talking about these things. We're in a political election year. We want to build our church. We want to build our program. We want to build momentum, right? And so let's not talk about these type of issues. Rather, let's talk about issues, he didn't say this, but this is what we would imply, that make you feel good, right? Let's talk about sex, right? Or let's talk about dating. Let's talk about just these individual aspects. And so we've kind of bathed ourselves in the church, the white evangelicals, it's just about consuming, right? I want to consume a product that makes me feel good as an individual, where it's just me and God, right? We have this language of, you need to have a personal relationship with God. But that is ignored, what Jesus says in the Lord's Prayer. He says, we are to pray for God's kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven. And so I think the job for white evangelicals is to say, yeah, obviously we have personal relationships with God, but our faith is not personal. Our faith is communal. And we are called to love our neighbor. And if our neighbor is being abused by the police, then that calls us to speak prophetically into institutions. And if those institutions are embracing an ideology of white supremacy, then God is calling us to denounce white supremacy and to say that, hey, like, we have a God who denounces that, but praise God, we have a God who died for that, right? So that we could be forgiven, so that we could be made whole, and so for that kingdom to come. So that would be, we have a lot of work to do. And that's, I guess, maybe the discouragement is maybe not just the secularized Black Lives Matter movement, because there's obviously many beautiful God-honoring things about that, right? I think my hesitancy is, man, I hope my people, my own white evangelicals, will kind of repent from these gods that we have embedded ourselves with in our faith. Thank you
so much for that. I know this would take another hour for us to unpack, but for the sake of Elizabeth doing closing remarks, thank you so much on from my end for answering those questions for us. And over to you, Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you, guys. Thank you. If you will graciously, in 10 seconds, right? So I have 3 minutes to wrap up. 10 seconds, 6 words. What is one thing, if nobody was to watch anything else but hear your last 6 words, what would you want them to hear? And David Henderson, let me start with you.
Open your ears, soften your hearts, and treat others the way you'd like to be treated.
Awesome. David Washera?
Wow. How do you go after that? It's just touche, David. For me, I would say we are society. As individuals, if we want to change society, we must first change ourselves. The change begins with us and works our way to the societal and institutional level.
Okay, more than 6 words, but we got you. Pastor David, I know this is a challenge for you as a pastor. My daddy is a pastor. 6 words.
I think it's the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Right.
It's the power of salvation for the Jew and the Gentile.
Yes.
And that's what's going to bring us together and dismantle this mess.
Yes. And the word of God says that God is love, right? So if we are his followers, if we are believers, then we show love, not only with our mouth, but with our actions. Galatians 3:28 says there is neither Jew nor Gentile, nor slave or free, neither male or female, for you all are one in Christ Jesus. And that is a heartbeat of this conversation, is that check your doctrine, right? Where in the word of God has it says for you to mistreat others, right? It talks about caring for the poor, caring for the orphans, caring for those that are under you that you're protecting. Check your politics. What is the moral compass that is guiding the decisions you are making in the church house, in your job, in the courts of law? What are those things? What are those values, those beliefs that guide who you are? And we have been challenged to challenge this individualistic idea of me feel good, right? I want to feel good at the expense of other people, at the expense of that other individual. And at the basis of it all is humanity is one race. And until we value the individual as human and worth dying for, worth loving, worth respecting, with treating the way we would want to be treated, we can tackle this. And racism and other discriminations, whether it is gender, whether it is discrimination because of your culture, your accent, what you believe, the values that you live by, these isms, these pillars, these Goliaths in our society. David and Goliath was the story today that the underdogs can overthrow these Philistinic, this big bad wolf, right? And the call to all of us as brothers and sisters, black, white, green, yellow, Indian, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you believe, is that we are all human and we are all deserving to live life respected as human beings. So as we end today, let us challenge each other to listen with a soft heart, to listen with openness, to have conversations where we build bridges of understanding and acknowledge what is wrong, and choose to design a future. Yes, informed by the past, but choosing to not repeat our past. Thank you guys for tuning in. Shout out to our viewers. Thank you, panelists, for such a wow conversation, and continue doing the work that you're doing in the various platforms that you are in. And together, this change can come, maybe and hopefully, in our generation, but most importantly, for the future generation that is coming forth. God bless you to all tuning in, and good night.
Night, everyone.
Night. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you so